A dog sat motionless on the doorstep of a quiet home. Its gaze was fixed on the door, its body calm yet tense, as if it had a purpose no one could understand. It wasn't barking or pacing. It simply sat there, waiting. Inside, Ethan noticed it first. He'd just finished unpacking some boxes in his living room when he caught sight of the dog through the window. It wasn't his dog, and he couldn't recall ever seeing it in the neighborhood before. "Why's there a dog at my door?" he muttered, stepping closer to the window for a better look. It didn't look injured, lost, or scared. Instead, it sat with a quiet determination that felt unnatural. At first, Ethan ignored it, figuring the dog would leave on its own. But hours passed, and the dog didn't move, not even when other neighbors walked by. Something about its presence unsettled him. It wasn't just the persistence. It was the way the dog sat, calm but alert, like it was guarding something or waiting for someone. Eventually, Ethan decided to open the door. As he stepped outside, the dog raised its head, its eyes meeting his. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Hey, buddy," he said cautiously, his voice low. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it glanced toward the edge of the yard, then back at Ethan, as if it was trying to tell him something. Ethan's curiosity grew. What was the dog doing here? Why his house? He had no idea that stepping outside was the first step into a mystery far more chilling than he could have imagined. The quiet outside felt unnatural. The air hung heavy, with an eerie stillness that made Ethan feel as if he were being watched. Even the trees lining the narrow street seemed frozen, their branches unmoving despite the faint breeze. The dog sat unmoving at the edge of the porch, its posture rigid and its eyes darting to the yard every so often. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew something he didn't. He scanned the area, but nothing seemed out of place. The street was empty, the distant hum of a car engine barely audible. Yet, despite the ordinary surroundings, an invisible tension pressed down on him. Ethan's heart beat a little faster as he stepped closer to the dog. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured under his breath, as if the dog might actually answer. The animal remained silent, its intense gaze fixed on the bushes at the edge of the yard. Something about the way the dog stared unnerved him. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost as though it was guarding against something or someone. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, glancing over his shoulder, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. The faint rustling of leaves reached his ears, and he froze. His eyes darted toward the bushes. Was it just the wind, or was there something hidden in the shadows? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The dog let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a shiver down Ethan's spine. Whatever was out there, he wasn't alone, and it was clear the dog wasn't sitting on his porch without a reason. Ethan Carter had never been the kind of person to jump to conclusions or get easily rattled. A former Marine, he had learned to think on his feet, his calm demeanor a result of years spent in high-pressure situations. After his discharge, he sought a quieter life, away from the chaos. The small suburban neighborhood he now lived in seemed perfect, a place where he could escape the constant hum of the city, find peace, and rebuild his life. But even in this quiet refuge, something seemed off. It had been a few months since he moved into the old house on Maple Street. The neighborhood was welcoming, with families walking their dogs and children playing in the streets. But there was always a part of Ethan that felt disconnected from the world around him. He hadn't yet made many friends, and the haunting memories of his past, particularly the ones from his time in the service, still clung to him like shadows that never quite disappeared. Ethan's only companion was Max, a dog he had adopted from the shelter after his arrival in town. Max had been a stray, wary of strangers, but over time, he had grown attached to Ethan. The dog had a peculiar loyalty, almost a protective instinct, that Ethan had never encountered in any pet before. It was as if Max knew him in a way others couldn't, or perhaps it was the other way around. Still, even Max's presence couldn't dispel the lingering sense of unease Ethan had been feeling. The stillness of the neighborhood, the unspoken tension in the air, it all felt too calm. It was as if something was hidden beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. His instincts, honed in combat and years of survival, were constantly on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past, something he had tried so desperately to escape, was catching up to him. As Ethan stood there, staring at Max, he couldn't help but think of the dark times that led him here. The loss, the trauma, he had always tried to push it all away. But now, with Max acting strange and the atmosphere growing heavier, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something far bigger than himself. The sense that something was wrong, something was coming, clawed at him. Was it his past resurfacing? Or was it something else? Something he wasn't prepared to face? The unknown lay ahead, and Ethan knew that whatever it was, Max was determined to protect him from it. Ethan couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling anymore. It had started small, a shadow in the corner of his eye, a low growl from Max at odd hours. But now it was getting worse. Max wouldn't leave the doorstep. He sat there, staring intently at the door, his body rigid. Ethan tried to coax him inside, but the dog refused to budge. Something was wrong. The first time it happened, Ethan thought it was just a fluke. Maybe the dog heard something. He had heard strange noises at night, too. But when Max continued to sit at the door, day after day, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. He decided to investigate. Late one afternoon, after his work shift, Ethan decided to stay home. He had been meaning to clean out the attic, something that had been neglected since he moved in. As he climbed the stairs, he could hear Max's low whine from the bottom of the staircase. Ethan paused. The dog's constant vigilance was starting to get under his skin. "Come on, boy. Let's check this out," Ethan muttered, but Max didn't follow. He stayed by the door, his eyes fixed in an almost unnatural way. Ignoring the dog's plea, Ethan entered the attic, the air stale with the scent of dust and age. As he rummaged through old boxes, he stumbled upon an old, rusted key. It wasn't just any key. It had strange symbols etched into it, ones that Ethan didn't recognize. His heart raced. He hadn't seen this key before, but something about it felt familiar. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Max's frantic barking snapped Ethan back to reality. He rushed downstairs, his mind racing. He found Max still sitting by the door, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to ignore it, but something pushed him to answer. He opened the door slowly, expecting a neighbor, but to his surprise, there was no one there. Only the faintest trace of something odd. A dark, heavy scent hung in the air, like damp earth and something else. A scent he couldn't quite place. Max was growling now, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to reverberate in the stillness. His eyes were locked on something just beyond Ethan's line of sight, but Ethan couldn't see anything. Ethan stepped forward, his curiosity overtaking his caution. His foot hit something soft, and he looked down, startled. A small, bloodied object lay in front of the door. A piece of cloth. No, it was a scarf, drenched in dark, coagulated blood. The stench of it hit him like a physical blow. He backed away, disgust and fear settling in his gut. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered under his breath. He bent down to inspect the cloth further, his fingers brushing the fabric. There was something written on it, symbols like those etched into the key. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was connected to this. This place, the key, the blood, it was all tied to him. Max suddenly lunged forward, barking frantically, but Ethan managed to hold him back. Max's behavior was more than protective now. It was as though the dog knew something Ethan didn't, something terrible that was just beyond his reach. The following days were filled with mounting tension. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if the very walls of the house were closing in. He started noticing strange occurrences. Objects would be out of place, whispers in the wind when no one was around, and faint footsteps that seemed to follow him when he walked through the house. He'd turn around to find nothing, but the feeling of being observed persisted. Then, one evening, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table, Trying to make sense of it all, Max let out a growl from the hallway. Ethan froze. He had never heard the dog sound like this before. Ferocious, deep, almost as if he was trying to warn him about something beyond the threshold. Ethan jumped up, rushing toward the hallway, but as he reached the door, he froze. There was a figure standing outside, dark and still. The air seemed to drop in temperature, and a cold draft rushed past him. His breath came out in quick, visible puffs. Max was frantic now, pawing at the door, barking as if he were trying to protect Ethan from something far worse than anyone could imagine. Ethan reached for the handle, hesitating. The figure outside didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for him to make the first move. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice a shaky whisper, swallowed by the cold air. No response. Then, the door creaked open, not by Ethan's hand, but as if something else had nudged it. The figure stepped forward, its face hidden by a hood, and when it spoke, Ethan's heart nearly stopped. "It's not safe for you here anymore," the figure said, their voice cold and distant. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Who was this person? And how did they know about him? Max lunged at the door, but Ethan held him back. The dog was nearly frantic now, his body shaking. Whatever was out there, Max knew it meant danger. Why are you here?" Ethan demanded, his voice low and full of urgency. The figure's hooded face didn't reveal any emotion, but the air around them seemed to grow colder. "The blood has been spilled," the figure replied cryptically. "And you are part of it." Before Ethan could ask another question, the figure turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echo of their footsteps and an overwhelming sense of dread. Max whimpered at Ethan's feet, his eyes wide with fear. He looked down at the dog, trying to make sense of everything, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, it was tied to him and to the house. He had to find out what it all meant before it was too late. The key, the symbols, the blood, it was all part of a bigger puzzle. And he was about to step into the darkness without knowing how deep it went. Ethan stood frozen at the door, Max at his side, growling softly as the last remnants of the figure's footsteps faded into the night. He could still feel the chilling presence lingering, and the knot in his stomach tightened. There was no answer to his question. The mystery only deepened, and the danger felt all the more real. His pulse hammered in his chest as he glanced around the darkened hallway, the air thick with tension. The bloodied scarf, the one Max had discovered days ago, was still in the living room, lying discarded on the floor. Ethan hadn't touched it since that moment. Every time he looked at it, a feeling of dread surged through him. He could almost hear the figure's words echoing in his mind. "The blood has been spilled." What did that mean? Whose blood? And why was he involved? Max's low whimper interrupted his thoughts. The dog was no longer growling, but his anxiety hadn't subsided. He paced in tight circles, ears perked, eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of the room. Ethan crouched down beside him, trying to calm him, but deep down, he knew Max sensed something he couldn't see. It was as if the dog was in tune with some unspoken danger, something Ethan wasn't prepared for. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the silence of the house. Ethan's stomach dropped. Who could it be at this hour? He cautiously approached the door again, but before he could reach the handle, a cold breeze swept past him, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand on end. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, and Ethan hesitated for a long moment. Should he open it? The fear of what lay beyond the door clawed at him, but curiosity, no desperation, overpowered his fear. What if the figure had returned? What if this time they had answers? He steadied his breath and placed his hand on the doorknob. The cold metal sent a shiver through him. He turned it slowly, inch by inch, until the door creaked open, revealing the empty darkness of the front yard. But there was something more. A small, handwritten note resting on the doorstep, sealed with an odd, wax emblem. It was the same emblem as the one on the key. Ethan's heart pounded as he knelt to pick up the note. The air felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive sense of doom. He hesitated, staring at the piece of paper, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The message, written in uneven, hurried handwriting, sent a wave of unease over him. It's closer than you think. Don't trust the dog. It's not protecting you. His breath caught in his throat. What? His eyes flickered to Max, who was still pacing nervously in the hallway. Could this be true? He had trusted Max. He had always been a loyal companion, guarding the house with an unwavering presence. But now doubt crept in. What if the dog was part of whatever was happening here? What if Max knew more than he was letting on? Ethan shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't let his fear cloud his judgment. But the weight of the note, the words it contained, hung heavy on his chest. And then, without warning, the lights flickered. The bulbs above him buzzed and popped before plunging the house into total darkness. Max's low growl broke the silence, and Ethan instinctively reached for his phone, using its light to guide him. The glow barely cut through the blackness, illuminating only a few feet in front of him. Panic started to claw at the edges of his mind. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak in the floorboard sounded like someone, or something, was watching him. He could hear something else now, too. The faint sound of whispers, barely audible, coming from somewhere inside the house. The walls felt as though they were closing in around him. Ethan's breath quickened, his heart racing. The voices were becoming louder, and they were speaking his name. Ethan, it was barely a whisper, but the chilling tone made it feel as if it came from all directions. The air seemed to vibrate with an almost malevolent energy, as though something unseen was trying to make its presence known. Max's frantic barking grew louder, a desperate warning, but Ethan couldn't see where the danger was coming from. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had started, and in the silence that followed, Ethan heard something else. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. He froze, his mind racing. Was someone in the house? Had the figure returned? Or was it something far worse? Ethan had never felt more alone in his life. He slowly crept toward the staircase, the light from his phone shaking in his hand. Max followed close behind, his nails clicking against the floor as he trotted anxiously beside Ethan. The dog was no longer growling, but he seemed to be waiting, watching. Each step Ethan took felt like it echoed through the empty house. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft sounds of Max's breathing and the occasional creak of the stairs under Ethan's feet. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped. The house was eerily still. The footsteps had stopped, too. It was as though whatever or whoever had been there had been waiting for him to make the next move. He turned the corner into the hallway, his breath caught in his throat. Max's growl returned, deep and guttural, as the dog suddenly stopped in his tracks, staring at something in the darkness ahead. Ethan could feel the presence before he saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hall, their back to him, just within the reach of the faint light from his phone. The figure didn't move. They were wearing a dark cloak, the hood drawn over their face, leaving only the shape of their body visible. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stepped forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are you?" His words felt thick in his throat, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, they slowly turned toward him. And in that moment, as the light flickered, Ethan realized with a jolt of terror that he recognized the figure. The face, or what he could see of it, was hauntingly familiar. The same features, the same eyes, he had seen in his own reflection just hours earlier. The figure was him. His breath caught, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. The realization hit like a freight train. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was something much darker, and whatever was happening was drawing closer. And worse, Max had known it all along. The dog hadn't been protecting him. It had been trying to warn him. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stared at the figure at the end of the hallway. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. The figure standing before him, this doppelganger, this impossible version of himself, didn't move. The dark cloak hung loosely around its frame, and the hood cast an impenetrable shadow over the face. The silence was suffocating. Max's growl deepened, a primal warning that vibrated in Ethan's chest. The dog wasn't frightened anymore, he was resigned. And in that moment, a creeping realization settled in Ethan's gut. This wasn't some trick of the light, some shadow lurking in his mind. This was real. It was real. "Who are you?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. He didn't expect an answer, but he couldn't hold back the question. There had to be an explanation, didn't there? He'd seen it all, the note, the strange occurrences, the whispers. But this couldn't be happening. The figure didn't reply. Instead, it began to take slow, deliberate steps toward him, the cloak rustling softly with each movement. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn away, but he couldn't. His feet were frozen to the floor. Max's body tensed beside him, his tail held low, his ears back. The dog was clearly terrified, but he remained next to Ethan, never leaving his side. The two of them were trapped, caught between whatever force had manifested in the house and the reality that was quickly slipping away. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. Ethan flinched as the cold fingers brushed against his skin, and an icy chill shot through his body. It was like the touch of a ghost, cold, unnatural, and suffocating. "I am you," the figure spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. The words cut through the tension like a blade, but they were laced with something darker, something more sinister. Ethan felt a shiver slide down his spine. "No." Ethan's voice cracked as he backed away. "No, this isn't possible." But the figure stepped forward again, its eyes glowing faintly from under the hood, locking onto Ethan with an intensity that felt like it was reaching into his very soul. "You didn't listen to the warnings. You didn't see what was happening until it was too late. But it's time now." Ethan's mind reeled. Warnings? He had thought everything was just a series of coincidences, strange moments he couldn't quite explain. But now it was clear. This had been happening for longer than he realized. The note on the doorstep, Max's strange behavior, the growing sense of dread. All of it pointed to one thing: he wasn't supposed to survive this night. This doppelganger had come for a reason. Max's bark echoed through the hallway, but Ethan didn't move. His body was paralyzed by fear. He had never been more terrified in his life. Every cell in his body screamed for him to run, but the looming figure, his reflection, stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of him, an alternate version, maybe a dark version, something born from the very things he had ignored. "You've been living in the wrong version of reality, Ethan," the figure continued, its voice now filled with cold authority. "This house, this life, none of it was meant for you. It's time to pay the price for the choices you've made." "No, please," Ethan said, his voice a mere whisper, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, the faintest hint of a grin curling under the hood. "You've always been afraid of facing the truth, haven't you? Afraid to confront what lies beneath. But now the truth is here." Suddenly, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. Ethan's breath fogged the air in front of him as a deafening silence enveloped the house. The lights flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. Max's barking turned into frantic whimpering as the dog backed away, ears flattened, his eyes wide with terror. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, a sensation of suffocation, as though the walls were closing in around him. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on him. He felt the weight of the figure's gaze as it bore into him, the malicious energy crackling in the air. Suddenly, with a surge of panic, Ethan's mind snapped back to the note on the doorstep. "Don't trust the dog. It's not protecting you." A flash of realization hit him. Max had been trying to warn him, not protect him. The dog had known all along. Max hadn't been the loyal guardian he thought he was. No, Max had been the key to the figure's arrival. The dog was linked to this darkness. Ethan turned sharply toward Max, his voice frantic. "Max, what did you do?" The dog whimpered, backing away further, his eyes pleading as if he was begging Ethan to understand. Ethan could see the confusion in his eyes, the pain, as if Max himself was trapped in something far beyond his control. It wasn't his fault. Max was just another victim in this twisted game. The figure chuckled softly, its laugh echoing like a distant memory. It's too late to save him now. All of you are bound together, trapped in this cycle. At that moment, Ethan understood. This wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was a battle for his soul, his very existence. The figure had come to collect what was due, to take him back to where he belonged. But Ethan wasn't ready to give up. Not without a fight. With one final burst of courage, Ethan lunged at the figure, his hands outstretched. The moment his fingers brushed the figure's cloak, the world around him seemed to unravel. The hallway, the house, everything around him warped and twisted as though reality itself was collapsing. The oppressive darkness surged inward, pulling him deeper into its grip. And then everything stopped. Silence. Ethan opened his eyes, but the world before him was different. He was back in the living room. Max was beside him, lying on the floor, his fur ruffled but calm. The house was quiet again, still, as if nothing had happened. But deep down, Ethan knew something had changed. The figure, the dark presence, hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lingering in the corners of his mind, waiting for the next mistake. The tension in Ethan's chest didn't ease. It would never ease. He was living with the consequences of his actions, and he knew now, with haunting certainty, that the truth would always find its way to him. And Max was still watching him with those knowing eyes. As Ethan stood in the living room, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy weight, the truth began to settle in. The figure, the strange doppelganger, the dark presence, everything had led to this. Max, the dog he had trusted to protect him, wasn't the innocent guardian he had believed him to be. The real enemy had always been the choices he'd made, the truths he'd ignored. The world had a way of drawing its own lines, and no matter how hard he fought, those lines would eventually catch up with him. In a strange, twisted way, he understood now. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a confrontation with the darkness within himself. The choices, the mistakes, the things he'd buried deep down, they were all now awake and watching. Max sat silently beside him, eyes meeting his with an unsettling knowledge. Ethan didn't know what had happened, or why it had all come to this. But one thing was certain. The truth always finds its way out. It doesn't matter how much you try to hide it or deny it. It waits in the shadows, ready to expose you for who you truly are. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the figure would return. That somehow the story wasn't over, and this house, this night, had only been the beginning. He'd thought he understood what it meant to be protected, to be safe. But he now realized that safety was a fragile thing, built on the lies we tell ourselves to get by. As the minutes stretched on, Ethan's thoughts turned to what lay ahead. Would he ever find peace again? Could he ever escape the shadow of his past? The answers weren't clear, but the journey he'd begun was far from finished. And as long as Max sat beside him, waiting, he knew he was never truly alone in the darkness. The silence lingered, broken only by the soft click of the door, shutting behind them both. What do you think really happened in that house? Was Max just protecting Ethan, or was there something darker at play? Drop your thoughts and predictions in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you're not already part of our community, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on our next spine-chilling mystery. Stay tuned for more stories that will keep you up at night. Don't forget to like and share if you enjoyed this eerie journey. And remember, the darkness never stays quiet for long.